Now, the panel will be chaired by two able chairpersons here. Firstly, my colleague Björn-Ola Linnér, who is professor at the Tema department here at Linköping University and the former director of our center as well. And he will be joined by Ulrika Raab, who is senior advisor on climate change at the Swedish Energy Agency. As you heard, Ulrika is a highly experienced negotiator or member of the Swedish delegation to the UNFCCC. And so she will offer us the sort of negotiators sort of practical sort of inroad to this discussion. And we're very pleased to have both of you here. And I will hand over the word to you, and then you can introduce our three panelists.
No, this is not, now it's on, okay. Yes, so the three panelists, we're very happy to have them here. They represent three different areas of expertise in this field, so we're very glad that they were willing to participate in this panel. Catherine Horst-Stettler in the middle is the Center for International Governance Innovation, Chair of Governance in the Americas at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and she's also Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And her most recent book is the prize-winning Greening Brazil, Environmental Activism in State and Society, which she has written together with Margaret Keck. Steinar Andresen is a political scientist in the field of international relations. He's a research professor at FNI and adjunct professor at the Pluricourt Center of Excellence at the University of Oslo. And he works primarily, but not exclusively, on global environmental governance. That's Steinar to the right there. And to the left is Radoslav Dimitrov. He has participated in the environmental diplomacy for 15 years. So he has that in common with Ulrika. And he has served at the European Union delegation to the UN climate negotiations. He's a professor at the Western University in Canada and a consultant on climate diplomacy to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. His academic research is published on institutions and governance, appears in several of the prominent journals in the field, and he has also written the 2006 book Science and International Environmental Policy in numerous and contributed to numerous handbooks in the field. We ask the participants in the roundtable to address the following topic in 4 minutes, so they have short. We give a short opening statements, and then we can continue the discussion with you. And you can also, those who watch this online, again, ask questions via the Twitter. We ask them to reflect upon what they see as likely in 2 questions and what they would prefer in a final question. What are the prospects for a climate deal in 2015? Will it be Copenhagen all over again? Or is the negotiation process and its goals fundamentally different from 6 years ago? And finally, what would you like to see as the essential mechanisms or cornerstones in the potential treaty? They are, of course, not restricted to those questions. They have proposed other things to discuss as well, which we appreciate. So, please, we turn the floor over to you. Should we start with Radoslav?
Hello, everyone. It is really a distinct pleasure to me to be among friends and colleagues who are interested in the same topics. It feels like a little cozy tribe of people.
Could you have it a little bit closer to your mouth?
Yes. Can everyone hear it? Yes. I think that as most questions, the answers depend on who you ask.
Let's trade.
Okay.
I think that's easy.
I feel a bit like Han Solo here.
I'll be your co-signer.
So I think that, as with most questions, the answers depend on who you ask. If you turn to the academic world, most observers declare with a degree of certainty that we cannot expect a meaningful agreement in the foreseeable future because of the enormous complexity of the problem, because of the consensus requirement in the current negotiations, and various political reasons that have been already listed here. David Victor, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, Steinar Andresen, and his colleagues in Scandinavian countries, we all tend to converge on this. If we turn our attention to the world of diplomacy, I think that it is relevant to see what diplomats think. And I regularly ask policymakers and diplomats from various countries. And last March, during the meeting in Bonn, I was fortunate to speak for a while with the head of the Japanese delegation. And the Japanese are usually very, very guarded. They would not speak about politically sensitive issues. But it was very telling to hear both people at the top of their delegation to state without any hesitation that they really don't think there will be a strong deal in Paris. Similar views have been expressed by diplomats from Brazil, from island countries, even from some European countries. And I think this is quite relevant, particularly given that these views are being expressed a year and a half before the Paris meeting. It is also important to note that there are certain countries who have voiced already strong opposition to an agreement next year. There are rumors, for example, that in internal G77 consultations, several countries in the developing world are really trying to pull the entire process back. The Philippines, for example, has said, what's the rush? Why do we need a Paris deal? Why not later? I think that those are also important signals. At the same time, in my view, there will be a deal in Paris. There will be a deal because there has to be one. When you speak to people from the Secretariat, also they're open about this. Just like there had to be a deal in Copenhagen of one kind or another, chances are that there will be some form of an agreement next year. I'm also quite positive that there will be some grandiose title to it. I think we come up with a label that sounds impressive. The real question is what will be the content of that agreement. In my view, the most likely content will be some kind of a hybrid system of climate governance that will combine bottom-up and top-down approaches. Bottom-up approaches with some sort of pledges, whether they're soft, as Sebastian said, or harder, on domestic commitments, combined with some form of international rules that inform and perhaps facilitate to a point those domestic actions. And in this context, it's good to mention that there are some disagreements even within the umbrella group, because in Bonn, the US and Australia cross swords a little bit. The US basically saying domestic actions first, let's see what's on the table. And Australia was saying very politely, no, because what countries are willing to do depends on the international rules, and we need to see international rules that facilitate future actions. Let me finish my initial comments with the notion that I am afraid that the agreement next year will be some kind of vacuous meeting, regardless of the title. Sorry, a vacuous agreement, regardless of the title. I have published on the concept of decoy institutions. In world politics, governments sometimes create institutions that are deliberately designed not to deliver any policy. You know, one prominent example, the United Nations Forum on Forests, but there are many other examples, and I call them decoy institutions because they effectively serve to preempt rather than provide governance. And the Copenhagen Accord was an attempt to create a decoy institution, and I was witness to the conspiracy, there's no other words to use it, to greenwash Copenhagen and to create a grandiose Copenhagen Accord that is stuffed with numbers, but that doesn't have any legal binding powers. That attempt failed, and my real fear is that Paris will succeed in producing such a decoy agreement. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. We'll wait with the questions then and have all the presenters. Would you prefer to be Han Solo or Miley Cyrus?
I don't know. Let's see if I can manage it.
Okay.
Can people hear me? Well, I'm really pleased to be here with a group of people who all know quite a bit more about climate than I do as a relative latecomer to this. And what I really want to do is respond to what Rado said, but I can't do that. I'll just give my initial prepared talk, or 4-minute brief summary of what I might be thinking about this. And I've spent the last 4 or 5 years looking at the basic countries in particular, Brazil, India, South Africa, and China, and their positions in the climate agreement. So, as Rado said, you know, the prospects for an agreement really depend on who you ask. So I'm answering these questions from the standpoint of having been talking to, especially Brazil and South Africa, the sort of quieter members of this group, and just arrived from Johannesburg, actually. And you know, I think that from the standpoint of these groups, I see very little prospect for a hard multilateral agreement. And there's a real sticking point for these groups, and you can see it in the things that they say together jointly, which is, you know, the most consistent position that they all take is that there needs to be more action on the part of developed countries. This is a set of countries that will also not ratify a hard multilateral agreement. I think that's just a hard sticking point. Now, I'm not sure that I think that the Copenhagen Accord was such a decoy. And one of the reasons that I don't think so is because I've gone on now to looking at some of the things that the basic countries are doing in their own national politics. And there's really some striking movement in areas like renewable energy and other dimensions of what they're doing at home in Brazil's increasing ability since 2005 to control deforestation, so that there is some real emissions reductions coming from this set of countries. And you know, one of the things that these couple of days have made me think about is really how much of that can you trace to the putting out of even voluntary agreements in 2009 of the Copenhagen Accord. And I would say on the basis of the 2.5 weeks I've just spent in Johannesburg, I really think that South Africa would not have contracted 4,000 megawatts of renewable energy since 2011 had it not been in the larger context of the climate agreement and then a whole series of other things, the climate commitment that they made in 2009. And so I think there are some real important actions underway inside countries that may be responsive to some of these international movements. So even though I couldn't quite tell Rado's final position, I think I'm more pessimistic than him on the idea that there might be a binding agreement, but I think that there probably will be more of these soft agreements. It's the only thing that the U.S. could agree to, and in that context, the only thing that the basic countries would agree to. There could be agreements that might actually have some impact. And we were also asked, will the process be like it was in Copenhagen? And one of the things that I think about with reference to the basic countries, it's often talked about as this kind of helicoptering in of the countries in the U.S. at the last minute and set aside a whole long negotiation. And I'm pretty sure that if that's how you understand what happened in the process in Copenhagen, that won't happen again. Partly because of the very problematic legitimacy of that process. It's so clearly problematic that I don't think that will happen. But I also don't think it will happen because of changes inside the basic countries themselves. I mean, the shift from Lula to Dilma in the presidency of Brazil is a really big shift in how Brazil thinks of itself in the international system. And I think you could take some of those kinds of things. Jairam Ramesh, as the Indian negotiator in 2009, has been replaced with negotiators who are nothing like him. And I think that there's a series of things then that make it unlikely that the process will again see that kind of last-minute helicoptering. I don't know if there's anybody in this room who thinks that's a good thing, but if you do, I don't think it will happen. If you think that it's a problematic thing, I'm also pretty sure that that's not going to be the process in Paris.
Thank you. I think a lot has been said here, so I can be very brief. Yes, there will be an agreement. And yes, it will be a last-minute agreement, as always. And yes, it's going to be very close to a catastrophe or breakdown just before the agreement. So the agreement is going to look not so bad compared to what could have happened if there was no agreement. So in that sense, I think we will have a repetition of previous processes. When it comes to content, I think it will be a pledge and review, soft bottom-up approach, maybe some top-down aspects, but I don't think so. Of course, we don't really have top-down in international relations because everything essentially is bottom-up in practice. We don't get more than a soft bottom-up because of China's sovereignty, US sovereignty, as well as other countries saying the same thing. Interestingly, the pledge and review approach was suggested by Japan as early as in 1991. Scorned by the EU, scorned by the NGOs, now we're there. I don't think it's necessarily that much of a difference between top-down and bottom-up. That's an empirical question. But certainly the pledges made so far is not very impressive. But the design as such, I'm not sure that makes that much of a difference. What's going to happen in Paris is going to be interesting in a process perspective. We're going to say a lot about diffusion, learning, and whatever. From a result-based perspective, what I'm most interested in, it won't make that much of a difference. I don't think so. It's probably going to be a little better than nothing, but it's not going to halt the trend towards rising emissions. The key is to get the developing countries on board. We are preoccupied with the OECD and the EU. That's not the most important actors anymore. And unless we get the South on board, it's not going to happen much. And so far, I'm not very optimistic. They are concerned about economic growth, as are the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed those presentations. Sometimes I think this is just for my benefit. I get invited here because I get good advice on what I can do better in my job and also better understand what other people do when I go into negotiations. And I certainly have a lot of questions, and being the one on the microphone, I'll take an opportunity to launch a few of my questions. And of course, wanting all you to be engaged as well. I think you spoke about the deal in different terms. You related to the Copenhagen play out, also with all the important heads of state flying in for the very last day and starting their own process in closed rooms with special pals coming up with something that was quite alien or different from what diplomats have been working on for several years. From my point of view, that is also the contrast on who someone who's elected for a 4-year period will view on a successful deal and what they need to be able to report on when they come home, and the kind of more anonymous life of a diplomat who will go to his or her job for a decade or longer and work on something that possibly will deliver in a very, very long time frame. Expectation management is the label I would put on some of your presentations. Which brings me to the next question. Having delivered the expectation management, what do you think are the bare necessities? Not what you would like to have, because that will be a very long list indeed. But if you were allowed to pick, say, 3 things you would want, and perhaps you want to pick different things, but could you single out something that you would say, this would be really good, that would be something to build upon for the prospect of actually combating climate change, because I think you made it quite clear that a 2-week meeting will not solve the climate change problem. And perhaps someone in the audience has also given thoughts to this matter, and take this opportunity to prick the brains here. There are microphones available, so if you have some questions now, you will be able to come back later on, but if you have some already now, then you could add on that. And then I think, Catherine, since you have the insights into the basics, the South Africans and the Brazilians, who clearly have done a lot at home, could you elaborate on a bit on the difference between promising to do things and doing things? What is the discrepancy due to?
You want me to answer all those questions at once? Well, promising to do things and doing things, I think, is an interesting question. I actually think for the basic countries, I don't think of it in those terms, because here's how I think of it. I think of it this way. When Brazil made a commitment in 2009 to reduce its emissions by 34% by 2020, it actually, at that point, because of the drop in deforestation since 2005, had already mostly met that commitment. And I think actually that the basic countries tend to think a lot more like that international commitments come after action rather than before them. And so, in fact, I would say you would, with this set of countries, be less likely to find them promising to do things and not doing them, because they won't make the promises until they're ready to do them. I mean, one of the things I learned in South Africa, for example, with all this renewable energy that they've contracted private builders to build, they've got a clause in all the contracts that says, if we at some point sign on to a binding climate agreement that requires us to reduce emissions, we get the carbon credits from these projects. Well, that's sort of forward thinking. You know, they're already at some stage thinking that there's going to be an agreement, and when it comes along, that they're going to already have a big chunk of their carbon credits in their wallet. Done. And so I would say with the basic countries in particular, I don't think this is as big a gap. And it's, you know, and it's of course the other side of it then is that they're hugely reluctant to make commitments. In part because they want to have them done already.
On your first question about necessities, what could be better? I think more openness in the UN system towards other supplements or alternatives to try to coordinate or at least facilitate some of the work being done outside the UN would be a positive step, and not only think in UN kind of ideological circles. So, for example, being somehow able to coordinate or at least work on the different trading schemes that are elaborated. I also think a lot can be done in improving the reporting system to know better. I mean, these are small process traces, but they can be done. Also, the idea, I think, of lead countries, as you have in certain environmental agreements on certain aspects, as well as a combination of soft and hard approaches. So these are small, more processed things, but they can be done. The big things, I'm not optimistic, as I said. Thank you.
In my view, there is one main necessity, and that is a deal bilateral between US and China. I've heard voices from different directions that the two countries are actually very, very heavily engaged in a conversation about climate change. And also, these voices were quite optimistic. Many people really feel that there is progress in these bilateral talks, and therefore some kind of bilateral deal before the end of next year would not be entirely surprising. It will open enormous opportunities for the global climate regime, because if this happens, then we'll have the EU and China and the United States all on board for a really strong regime. And then it will be, the crucial then question would be, what incentives can be offered to countries to go under a treaty? Now, the fine distinction here is that in many countries are already ready for domestic action. In fact, many of them are already doing it. So the reluctance here when it comes to climate governance is not about domestic action. The reluctance is to go with international legal obligations under a treaty. And so then the political exercise and the task for current negotiators would be if the United States and China open that new door with a bilateral, then what incentives can we give to other key countries to accept even their existing actions under a formal agreement?
Thank you.
Just
Actually,
just-
I have a few more
sorry.
questions for you as well. So could you, when you answer that one, could you also tell me, you spoke about pledge and review. Someone makes a pledge and then later on it's being reviewed. What are the elements necessary for a successful review? Steinar, I'm sure you've thought about this matter, so could you add that on to your answer to Radoslav's comment as well?
At least first on the question of a bilateral US-China agreement, don't you think what would be crucial then would be the content of that treaty? You seem to imply that it would be a good treaty. Couldn't it also be a kind of, they have much more than 50% of the emissions. So they're really controlling the game. And so far, they haven't exactly been pushers. So I'm not sure I'm that optimistic. If you get an agreement, whether that's going to be positive or not. I think I'd take that one first. So, you want to?
Yes. A very, very good point. Yes, an agreement can be good or bad or anything in between. And I think that if you look at the domestic landscape and key actors, there is awareness in both countries that, that climate policy is not only necessary, but that there are also economic benefits to be reaped from an energy transformation. You can even read that from official, government sources in both countries, government documents. You can read it from economists working in both countries. And so, from this point of view, I'm hoping that if there is a bilateral deal, it will be somewhere in the direction towards low-carbon development.
Well, I would just comment as an American that, yes, there is a recognition of economic benefits in both of these countries, but there's also a lot of non-recognition of economic benefits in both of these countries. I mean, there's a phenomenon recently of municipalities passing laws that say that the Agenda 21 cannot be enforced in their municipalities. And as an academic, I've always thought that Agenda 21 was a really spectacularly weak institution, and the notion that you would need to pass legislation to protect yourself from the invidious implementation of this big UN plan sort of gives you a sense of the extremity to which some US actors are moving. And so I agree with you that you can certainly find lots of evidence, and there's new academic research on the hidden developmental state in the United States, a lot of which is oriented around things like green industry and things like that. But boy, there's a lot of other stuff going on too.
I think we should let the audience to come into this. We have several roundtable debates here. We have several roundtables, but this part of the circle then. Yes, someone far up here. Please also say your name when you pose your question.
Hello, Elisabeth Corell, Södertörn University. It's located in South Stockholm. Apologies for a slightly off-topic question. You talked about the process of decision-making in climate change. What would you say are the most important impacts of this process on in other international environmental or sustainable development agreements as of 2008 or 2009 and onwards? I'd be very curious to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
And I'm sure there's someone else who's also curious about something. Yeah, here. On the way back, there is another question.
Thank you. Markus Lederer, University of Münster, Germany. Little thought experiment. Shortly before Paris, the Ukraine completely explodes. All the UN Security Council talks about is the Ukraine and a new Cold War. Meaning climate change kind of finally gets off high politics. Nobody cares in the high diplomatic circles about climate change. Will this be positive or negative for an outcome in Paris? Meaning, do we really need head of states, or wouldn't it be much better if only the technicians of climate politics are able, and then we have some learning, we have some agreement maybe on the technical aspects, but forget about the politics?
Sounds delightful to me. Some questions down here.
Ukraine,
Yeah.
please.
No. Technicians. Ukraine, please stay stable.
Yes, and we have a question from the Twitter.
Hey everyone, we have a world talking right now, and they ask us, could the entire UNFCCC process be a decoy meant to go nowhere by many of the participating states? Maybe it's too general, but this is what the world is interested in.
We are being observed. That's good.
Yes.
Transparency. Shall we pose on to the panel to tag off on those questions?
None of us want to talk. I'll start with the middle question, the question about whether we'd be better off with climate change simply being negotiated by the technicians who are there looking at the long-term view, have been part of the process for a long time. I think if we did that, we'd probably get a pretty good agreement. And then I think it would be completely unimplemented. I mean, I'm afraid that you see that kind of gap often in national policy making too, that many times technical people understand very well what would be a good agreement, but the problem is that policymakers are looking at climate change at the same time that they're looking at things like unemployment rates, and even the best technical climate agreement is going to run against the fact that policymakers have to implement it, and they implement it in a context in which they're actually looking at a much wider variety of issues. And I personally then think it's better to have the policymakers part of the process from the beginning rather than having them try to implement a very nice agreement that won't fit their larger agenda. That's just one of the questions.
On the last question first, even I am not that cynical. So I don't think it's a complete decoy.
And he's very cynical.
Yes. So maybe it's for some, but I don't think for all. So as such, I don't think it's a decoy. On the second question on the Ukraine crisis, I'm not sure I have much more belief in bureaucrats and technicians than policymakers. If you look at Copenhagen, when the high-level segment came, there was not a single word on the table. So it was kind of a negative behind the doors deal that was closed. But before the high-level segment, we had nothing. So whether one is worse than the other, there's also the hypothesis the high-level segment is once in a while able to break the deadlock. So I'm not sure. I think it's no clear answer to that question. As to the first question, I'm not quite sure I got it, Elizabeth, but one thing at least I'm concerned with is it reinforces and strengthens the, in my opinion, more and more artificial north-south dimension, which is very, very negative. That is not to say that you have real poor countries, but you have quite a few countries that are not really poor anymore, but they hide behind that label, which is very detrimental to international negotiations and cooperation. Thank you.
On the role of presidents and prime ministers, I think that with an issue this big, we do need leadership at the highest level, but it's got to be at the right time and in the right manner. In Copenhagen, there were problems because that declaration drafted by 25 or 26 heads of state, they literally had pens in their hands drafting a declaration, and that is not their job, right? So on the question of the decoy, I don't think that the entire process is a decoy, but I do have real fears that an agreement in Paris will be a decoy. And if we have a bad agreement that sounds very impressive, it will throw dust into a lot of eyes. And I think that it will really create problems for real progress in climate governance in a number of countries. And so perhaps then no deal in Paris will be better than a decoy agreement. And then finally, to Elizabeth's question on the impact of this process on other policy regimes, I do think that there is a indirect but very tangible positive impact. Because the entire conversation about climate change has really elevated the environment and the status of the environment in public perceptions and public awareness. And I also want to say that, in my view, the climate diplomacy has succeeded in very important ways. It has failed to deliver formal agreements that we care about. But this obscures the real success of climate diplomacy, which is to affect perceptions of national interest and cost-benefit calculations about climate policy. And this was done through the conversation that took place at the international level and through arguments particularly maintained and emphasized by the European Union about win-win solutions, about the economic benefits of energy and climate policy. That is, I think, the key mechanism through, in my mind, through which climate diplomacy has affected climate governance around the world in different corners.
Shall we take a few more questions from the audience again? Richard?
Thanks. Richard Klein, SCI and CSPR. I would argue one of the reasons Copenhagen failed, or at least went off a pretty bad start, was the fact that there was this Danish text that surfaced in Singapore. That, before COP15 even started, it looked like the Danish hosts had a plan B in case there was not going to be an agreement during the COP. And of course that led to all sorts of issues of trust and legitimacy. Do you think that the French host, or the European Commission for that matter, will be able to resist the temptation to draft a French text?
Yes, Sebastian also. You have to run.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to get clarity on an issue that I didn't discuss in my presentation either that much. And that is, you were talking about also soft, etc. And I also mentioned soft. What does that mean in your view? Will there be a treaty or something else in Paris? And I think and where I'm coming from is that there's frequently, as in the debate, either it's a success or it's a failure, then it's either it's binding or it's non-binding. But I think there are many ways in which things can be binding and can be in a treaty, and certain things can be soft in there and harder, etc. And there's a lot of differentiation, I think, that we tend to forget.
Yeah, we take those two questions.
First, to Sebastian's question, I clearly would be very, very surprised if there is any form of binding treaty in Paris. If this happens, I think it will be a big surprise in world politics. My guess, again, a political scientist knows about the future as much as anybody else. But my guess is that there will be an agreement in Paris called something else, and probably with a very ambiguous status, outcome with a legal force. But about the French hosts, I am based in France now for 6 months on sabbatical, and I have some observations about French society and culture, which I relish tremendously, but that makes me very apprehensive about the way the French will host the meeting next year. And I hope that they will master all of their, resources and venerable tradition in diplomacy to organize a very effective meeting And I will not be surprised if they have something under the table.
I will defer to Rado on whether or not it will happen, but I would just reinforce that it would be a very bad idea from the standpoint of getting an agreement. And to Sebastian, I think, it is hard to define sometimes what we mean by hard and soft laws, but I would basically say a treaty that has to be ratified by the US Senate will not happen. So when I say soft, I mean something softer than that.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, could you? Would you like her to expand on that right away, before?
I thought it doesn't mean there couldn't be a treaty, right?
Well, this is one of these things where I am not a scholar of the United States, despite being from there. But I think if it says treaty in the title, then it can't go. But there are lots of international instruments of legal weight. What was the phrasing?
An outcome of legal force.
There are lots of, yes, about which there would be more discussion. Something that says treaty in the title would be unacceptable, but other things would be debatable.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add on Sebastian's question here. I'm not an expert on French politics, so I have no idea what they plan to do. But it's going to be interesting to see what role the role between France and the EU, whether that is going to be coordinated. Because the EU has certainly an important role here, but whether it's going to be French or EU or some kind of combination, that's going to be interesting to see.
Okay. Ulrika, you had a follow-up question, then we turn to the
Actually, it was a saying that I suddenly recalled. I've been to far too many negotiations meetings, but there's a COP host, a country that is the host of the meeting, and in 2015 it will be France. So they will not be taking their usual role as part of the EU because they will first and foremost be the host. And as a previous host once said, that you can invite your guests, but you can't make them behave. And I think quite a lot of work has to be going on between meetings in countries being prepared to come to the negotiating table and close some of the issues. The question is, which issues are those? And I know from going to some research conferences, etc., it's quite interesting, but possibly also of academic interest, to look at the form of an agreement, if it's legally binding or outcome of legal force, or if it has appendixes that are part of the treaty, or just appendixes. Do they need to be ratified or can be done by presidential decree, etc.? I think those what might be very sensitive points, but they can also be sorted out. There are ways. What intrigues me quite a lot is a treaty, or the intention of a treaty, or the agreement being implemented. Will countries go home and feel, yes, now let's get to work and do different things on mitigation, adaptation, finance? And that would be my plea to you, because we're wrapping up now. Could you see some elements in the Copenhagen, well, not the Copenhagen, but the Paris Agreement that actually would make that happen? Kind of rephrasing my first question again. What are these necessities? And then you have a list.
Yeah, can we add, we had a question on the top row, so we had that as well.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Frank Fisher, Rutgers University in the United States. Listening to your assessments, I find myself wondering if there will ever be a binding agreement. How long would it take if there is one? And what are the options if there will be no binding agreement?
Yeah, I can add to that before you start to wrap up. Listening to this, it feels like everybody is almost as pessimistic as Steinar. Is there anything on the horizon that you see that could fill the gap that we have seen in the UNEP reports and so on? And Roger Pilke could not, unfortunately, in the end join us today, as talked about that we need to triple the decarbonization rate with a 3% GDP growth to 2050, we should lower the emissions by 50% compared to 1990 levels. How at all would that be possible with what we see on the horizon, at least as the discussion has gone so far?
Yeah, I can. Yes, I'm not very optimistic on part of the UN track. But I think it's important, as many others have pointed out during this conference, that there is quite a bit going on that is or is not closely linked to the UN negotiations. I mean, there is a lot. If you look at the dynamics at different levels, I think that might be more important than whether you have a binding agreement or not on the global level. Because I think the process is now underway that is driven by many forces. It's NGOs, it's scientists, it's a multi-layer of activities that I think have some promise. It's not been able to deliver too much yet, but it's a process. But the problem is that this process so far is mainly in the OECD region. It has also to move to the south to have a real impact. But whether you have a binding agreement or not, I don't think that is the most crucial thing for what's going to happen in relation to climate-related activities. I think other forces may be more important in the long run.
I completely agree with Steinar. I don't necessarily think that the binding agreement will be a good thing and not entirely necessary either. Because indeed there's a tremendous level of domestic action already taking place, and some of it will continue. From my point of view, I think that diplomacy has already played its role in spreading this idea that this makes sense from an economic point of view. I will stop here.
Well, I've been thinking about Ulrika's question about like what would make countries go home with a smile on their face and enthusiastic, and and pairing it with Steinar's observation that this has to move to the developing world. I mean, at the risk of being really obvious, well, finance would be one thing, and finance would be a second thing, and finance would be a third thing. I mean, I really do think that that's one thing that you could get a lot of countries outside the OECD really excited about if there were really serious and large finance commitments. Now, I understand that would also make all the countries of the OECD go home depressed or simply not able to deliver, but that would be something that would provide a significant shot in the arm. I mean, there's a serious feeling on the part of not just the basic countries, but the G77 generally, that they have been given promises for years of finance that will help them adapt to a problem that they did not cause, help them mitigate a problem that they are now beginning to cause. The basic countries themselves, except for India, I think are not so much looking for money for themselves, but I think the finance issue is really, really big, and a really big part of why that set of countries feels like this process has not paid off for them like they would hope that it would. But I do actually have to agree with my counterparts up here that there is usefulness to the process in and of itself. I mean, I think that you can't really do the historical counterfactual, but I think if we hadn't been having these COPs over the last 20 years, really most of this action that is going on quite possibly would not be going on, and certainly not at the scale that it is. So whether or not there's a multilateral agreement, I don't know that we really have to look for an alternative to fill the gap. I think the process is itself in some ways filling the gap.
Thank you. So would you like to wrap up? Are there anything you would like to, as a final statement, or the audience maybe one final statement? Here comes the solution. Yes.
No, I just want to disagree. I think bindingness is an important potential element of the signal that I was talking about. I think it comes in when you go to finance, to be able to activate the finance. I think it's an important element to get some bindingness. And just want to throw in that actually the US submission to the last negotiating session pretty much looked like a treaty, like saying it. And then we need final provisions for signature and ratification and stuff. And in that context, it's perhaps difficult to see that if the US is not in a treaty, that China would be in a treaty. But it's perhaps also difficult to imagine that if the US is in a treaty, that China wouldn't be in a treaty. So I think it can work both ways. And then it's just what the treaty says, what is binding, where you can have a lot of leeway of, whether everybody thinks then that the commitments will be binding as such. But there are other ways of binding parties. But that's just my take on it.
Thank you.
One of the major perks about going to this conference is the interesting discussions you have over lunch. And now we will have 1 hour of opportunity of after having those interesting discussions continuing over lunch.
Would you introduce the lunch? But first of all...
Excuse me, can I say just one thing? Someone said people can behave reasonably once they exhaust all the alternatives. So this is sometimes maybe how it will work in climate governance.
All right.
Okay.
Do the right thing once they've exhausted all obvious possible alternatives. Winston Churchill.
Okay, on that note, we'll end this session. Thank you very much to the chairs, to the panelists for all the questions. And after lunch, we'll open up a new theme for this symposium, which is about the scholarship of climate politics and governance. So what can we as scholars do to ignite new energy into this process, or to help us to think differently about this process? And so that's the theme for after lunch. But first, lunch, and it will be served in the restaurant downstairs where you had your coffee. So we'll reconvene again at 1 o'clock sharp.